The train didn't hiss into town. It screamed. It screamed to a halt on the edge of a place that God had clearly forgotten, a place called Mercy Ridge. There was no mercy here, only dust and silence. I'm Margaret Ellison, and I stepped off that train with a single carpet bag in my hand and a lie in my heart. The lie was that I was here for a new beginning. The truth was, I was running from an end. I was supposed to be met by a man named Dr. Elias Hart, a widower, his letters said, a healer, a kind man with a quiet home. His letters were my only hope, pages filled with promises of a small, respectable life, a life I could hide in. But Mercy Ridge was a tomb. A red cloth, stained with a painted cross, fluttered over the station door. Quarantine. It was a word that tasted like ash. The station master didn't even unload the mail. He just stared at me from the train window, his face a mask of pity. A passenger, a man with a cough that rattled his bones, muttered at me as he scurried back on board. "Get back on, ma'am," he wheezed. "This town's cursed." But I couldn't get back on. There was nothing to go back to. No family, no friends, just the ghost of a name I'd left behind in Boston. So I walked. I walked into the silence, past windows boarded up like sealed coffins. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was in the ground, seeping up through the soles of my boots. Somewhere in this dead town was the man who had written me those letters. Had he lied? Was he sick? Or was I just too late? My hand tightened around his last letter in my pocket, the paper worn thin from reading and rereading. "If you come, I'll be waiting," it said. "I promise you, Margaret, this town may be dying, but I'm not. Not if you're coming." The wind howled around me, a lonely, mournful sound, and I took my first step into the heart of Mercy Ridge, not knowing I was walking straight into a war for the soul of the town, and for my own. The silence was a physical thing. It pressed in on my ears, heavy and suffocating. Every house was a dark eye staring at me, windows shuttered, doors bolted. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No children played in the frozen yards. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for the final blow to fall. I found his house easily enough. A small white building with paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A simple wooden sign hung above the door, swaying in the wind. Physician. But this house was no different from the rest. The windows were dark voids. The porch sagged with the weight of neglect. And there, nailed across the front door, was another one of those red cloths. Another warning. Go away. But I had nowhere to go. I raised my fist and knocked. The sound echoed in the unnatural quiet, loud as a gunshot. For a long moment, nothing. Then a faint shuffle from within. A floorboard creaked. A voice, low and rough with exhaustion, cut through the wood. "Who's there?" "It's Margaret Ellison," I called out, my voice shaking less than I expected. "You wrote to me. You said you'd be waiting." Another pause, longer this time. I could feel him on the other side of that door, weighing his options. I heard the scrape of metal on metal, a lock turning, then another, and a third. The door creaked open, just a crack. A sliver of a man stood there. He was tall, gaunt, with shadows under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. A cloth mask covered the lower half of his face. His hair was a wild mess, and his shirt was stained with things I didn't want to identify. But his eyes were a startling hazel, and they weren't filled with curiosity or welcome. They were filled with pure, undiluted terror. "I told you not to come," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You asked me to," I shot back, holding my ground. I wasn't the timid girl who'd left Boston anymore. That girl was gone. "Things have changed," he said, trying to shut the door. I put my hand flat against the wood, stopping him. "So have I." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent battle of wills. Two strangers connected only by ink and paper. He was trying to protect me. I was trying to find a reason to exist. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He stepped back. "You can come in," he said, his voice flat. "But you won't like what you see." The smell hit me first. Antiseptic, sickness, and something else. Fear. The parlor wasn't a parlor anymore. It was an infirmary. Cots lined the walls, each one holding a still, sheet-covered form. A basin of rust-colored water sat on a small table. This wasn't a home. It was a last stand. My eyes landed on a small wooden cradle in the far corner, tucked away in the shadows. It was empty, but it looked recently used. A small knitted blanket was folded neatly over the side. "Was there a child?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the cradle. "Yes," he finally said. I waited for him to say more, but he just stood there, a statue carved from grief. I set my bag down on the floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "You didn't write for a wife, did you?" I asked softly. His eyes finally met mine. The terror was gone, replaced by a raw, bottomless sorrow. "No," he admitted. "I wrote for someone who wouldn't be scared of the dark." I looked around the room, at the ghosts in the cots, at the empty cradle, at this broken man standing before me. I thought of the darkness I'd left behind, the shadows that had chased me across a continent. "I'm not scared of the dark," I said. "I'm from there." Outside, the snow began to fall, thick white flakes blanketing the dead town. He finally took the mask from his face. "I'm Elias Hart," he said. Then he pointed to the cots. "And these are my neighbors." He walked over to a small desk littered with papers and glass vials. He picked up a bottle filled with a dark liquid. "They're not sick with a fever, Margaret." I took a step closer. "Then what is it?" He looked at me, his hazel eyes burning with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. "It's poison," he said. "Someone is murdering this town, one family at a time." The word hung in the air between us. Poison. It was an ugly, deliberate word. A fever was an act of God. Poison was an act of a man. "Who?" I asked, my mind reeling. "Why?" Elias ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion palpable. "The who is Silas Croft. He's a cattle baron from back east who wants this entire valley for himself. He's been trying to buy up land for years, but the folks here, they're stubborn. They don't sell." He gestured around the room. "So he found another way to clear them out." He explained that the sickness always started the same way. A stomach ache, a deep, unshakable fatigue. Then the fever would spike, and within a week, they were gone. But it wasn't random. It only hit the families who had refused Croft's offers, the ones with land bordering the river, the ones whose wells were the deepest. "He's poisoning the wells," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "I've been collecting samples, testing the water. I found traces of arsenic. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to mimic a wasting sickness over time. By the time I figured it out, it was too late for most of them." He looked at the empty cradle again. "My sister, her husband, their baby girl." The grief in his voice was a physical wound. This wasn't just a doctor fighting a plague. This was a man fighting for revenge. I didn't run. I didn't scream. Something inside me, something I thought had died in Boston, stirred to life. It felt like anger. It felt like purpose. I walked over to the filthy basin, rolled up my sleeves, and tipped the rusty water into the fireplace. "Where do you boil the water?" I asked. Elias stared at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and shock. "You're not leaving?" "I told you," I said, grabbing a stack of soiled linens. "I'm not scared of the dark." For the first time since I'd met him, a flicker of something other than despair crossed his face. He showed me the kitchen, the well out back. His own, dug deeper than the rest and lined with stone, which he suspected had saved him so far. He showed me his meager supply of herbs and medicines. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. I scrubbed the floors, burned the soiled rags, and boiled endless pots of water. I worked with a silent, focused fury. With every surface I cleaned, I felt like I was wiping away a piece of my own past. I was no longer Margaret Ellison, the disgraced woman who ran. I was a soldier in a silent war. Elias watched me, his silence a heavy presence in the house. He didn't help, but he didn't stop me. He just watched, as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. As night fell, casting long shadows across the snow-covered town, a sudden frantic banging echoed from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a desperate plea. Elias froze, his hand instinctively going to a heavy iron poker by the hearth. He looked at me, his eyes wide with alarm. The banging came again, louder this time, followed by a choked cry. "Doctor, for the love of God, open the door. Help me." Elias crept toward the door, poker raised. He peered through a small crack in the shuttered window. His body went rigid. "It's one of Croft's men," he whispered, his voice laced with venom. "It's Jebediah Thorne, his right hand." The man outside coughed, a terrible hacking sound, and then he collapsed against the door, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Please, I'm sick. He said it was just a stomach tonic." "I didn't know." Elias stood there, conflicted, his face a storm of hatred and duty. I walked up behind him and put a hand on his arm. "You're a doctor," I said softly. "Open the door." He stared at me, then at the door, the poker still clutched in his hand. The oath he had taken was at war with the vengeance he craved. Jebediah Thorne wasn't just one of Croft's men. He was the one who had delivered the eviction notices, the one who had laughed as families were forced from their homes. He was the face of their suffering, and now he was on their doorstep, begging for the mercy he had never shown. With a curse, Elias dropped the poker and unbolted the door. Thorne tumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor in a heap. He was pale and sweating, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes, wide with panic, darted around the room, taking in the cots, the grim reality of his handiwork. He gave it to me," Thorne rasped, clutching his stomach. "A celebratory drink, for a job well done. He said I was loose liability. Croft was cleaning house. Elias dragged Thorne to an empty cot, his movements rough and angry. But as he began to examine the man, the doctor in him took over. His hands, though shaking with rage, were gentle. He checked his pulse, listened to his breathing. I brought a cup of clean water and held it to Thorne's lips. He drank greedily, spilling most of it down his chin. "Why should I help you?" Elias asked, his voice cold as the winter wind. "You watched my family die." Thorne started to sob, great, gulping cries of a man who knows he's already dead. "I didn't know what it was," he cried. "I swear to God, I thought it was just to scare folks off. He's a monster, Hart, a devil. He enjoys it." Thorne grabbed Elias's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "He keeps the poison, the real stuff, in the old silver mine, up on Black Creek." He coughed, a spasm that shook his entire body, and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "He's planning something big. The land deeds. He's got 'em all filed for next week. He's gonna own the whole valley." The information was a bombshell, proof, a location. This changed everything. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a conspiracy they could expose. If they could get to the mine, if they could find the poison, they could take it to the federal marshal in the next county. They could stop him. But Thorne was fading fast. His breathing grew shallow, his eyes glassy. He looked past Elias, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And then he was still. Silence descended on the room again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Elias stood over the body, his face unreadable. He had spent months trying to save people from this fate, and now the architect of that fate lay dead at his feet. There was no victory in it, only a hollow, bitter taste. He finally looked at me, the exhaustion returning to his eyes. "The mine," he said, more to himself than to me. "I have to go to the mine." "No," I said, stepping forward. "You can't. If anyone else gets sick, you need to be here. I'll go." He just stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "Absolutely not. You don't know the terrain. You don't know Croft's men. It's suicide. It's suicide to stay here and do nothing," I argued. "He knows you're a threat, Elias. He just tried to poison your water again through Thorn. He'll be back. We need that proof." We stood face to face, the dead man a silent testament to the stakes. I saw the fear in his eyes, but it wasn't for himself. It was for me. And in that moment, I knew I had to be the one to go. I had to show him that I wasn't another person he had to save. I was a partner. "I've spent my entire life being told what I can't do," I said, my voice low and fierce. "I won't be told anymore." I turned and walked towards the door, grabbing a heavy wool coat from a peg. I didn't know the first thing about riding a horse through the mountains at night or about finding a hidden mine. But I knew how to be invisible. I knew how to survive. I stopped with my hand on the latch. He hadn't moved. "There's a pistol," he said quietly, "in the top drawer of my desk. Take it." I looked back at him, a silent thank you passing between us. As I stepped out into the biting cold, the snow crunching under my boots, a single thought echoed in my mind. I hadn't just found a reason to exist. I had found a reason to fight. The horse Elias gave me was a steady, older mare who seemed to know the mountain paths better than I knew the back of my own hand. The night was moonless, the world reduced to shades of black and gray. Snow-laden pines loomed over me like silent giants, their branches heavy with unspoken warnings. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of fear through me. The pistol felt heavy and alien in my coat pocket, a cold piece of metal that offered little comfort. My mind raced. What was I doing? I was a dressmaker's daughter from Boston, not a spy riding through the wilderness. But then I thought of Elias's face, the grief etched into every line. I thought of the empty cradle, and the fear was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I followed Thorne's dying words, keeping Black Creek on my left. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding higher and higher into the mountains. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A dark gash in the side of the mountain, partially hidden by a curtain of frozen ivy. The entrance to the old silver mine. I dismounted, tethering the horse to a low-hanging branch where she would be hidden from the trail. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the entrance. The air grew colder, and it carried a faint, chemical smell that made my nose wrinkle. This was the place. I pulled the pistol from my pocket, my hand trembling so hard I could barely hold it steady. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The mine was a labyrinth of cold stone and dripping water. I lit the small lantern Elias had given me, its flickering flame casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. The tunnel split in two directions. I chose the one on the right, the one where the chemical smell was stronger. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a few barrels. It was a stockpile. Dozens of wooden crates and barrels, stamped with skulls and crossbones, were stacked against the far wall. Croft had enough poison here to wipe out an entire state. This was the proof. I had found it. A sense of triumph surged through me. We could stop him. We could get justice. I reached into my bag to grab a small sample jar Elias had given me. My movements hurried. I was so focused on the barrels that I didn't hear the sound behind me. A soft scrape of a boot on stone. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I spun around, raising the pistol, the lantern light swinging wildly. A figure stood in the shadows at the entrance of the cavern. It wasn't one of Croft's men. It was a woman. She was old, her face a road map of wrinkles, her hair a wild mane of white. She was wrapped in animal furs, and she held a gnarled wooden staff in one hand. Her eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on me. "You are not who I was expecting," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. I stood frozen, the pistol wavering in my hand. "Who are you?" I stammered. "Some call me Clara," she said, stepping into the light. "The town witch. Others," she nodded towards the barrels of poison, "call me a ghost." It was the town's old herbalist. Elias had told me about her. She had disappeared years ago, presumed dead after a winter storm. "They said you died," I whispered. "It was safer that way," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "I saw what Croft was doing. I tried to warn people, but they called me a crazy old woman. So I watched. I waited." She had been living here, in the heart of her enemy's lair, a silent guardian. Then her eyes dropped to the pistol in my hand. "Dr. Hart sent you. He finally found someone brave enough. Or foolish enough." Before I could answer, a new sound echoed from the main tunnel. The unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on gravel. And then voices. Male voices getting closer. We both froze. Clara's eyes widened with alarm. "It's them," she whispered. "They're early. Croft's men, they were coming here. Right now. We were trapped." Clara moved with the speed of a startled deer. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled me deeper into the mine, away from the approaching voices. "This way," she hissed, extinguishing my lantern with a quick puff of air. Quickly. Plunged into absolute darkness, I stumbled after her, my free hand tracing the cold, damp wall of the tunnel. The voices grew louder, echoing through the passages. They were laughing. I heard the clink of bottles. They were here to collect their poison, and they were celebrating. Clara led me down a narrow, winding passage that I would have never found on my own. It was so tight my shoulders scraped against the rock. "He thinks I'm dead," Clara whispered, her voice close to my ear. "Croft, he paid a man to make sure I disappeared during that storm, but I knew these hills better than him. I watched him move his poison in here. I've been a ghost in his armory ever since." She was a survivor, a fighter, just like Elias, just like me. She finally stopped, pushing aside a heavy sheet of canvas that was covered in dust and rock, making it look like part of the wall. Behind it was a small hidden chamber, no bigger than a closet. A faint light emanated from within, cast by a single sputtering candle. The chamber was filled with drying herbs, strange-looking roots, and dozens of glass jars containing colorful liquids. It was a secret laboratory. "I haven't just been watching," Clara said, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "I've been working." She pointed to a small vial on a makeshift table. It was filled with a clear, shimmering liquid. An antidote. My jaw dropped. All this time, while Elias was fighting a losing battle, she was here, fighting a secret one. "Does it work?" I asked, my voice filled with awe. "It slows the poison," she said. "It gives the body a fighting chance, but it's not perfect. I'm missing one ingredient. A key ingredient." She looked at me, her expression grim. "It's a flower, a pale night-blooming blossom called ghost lily. It only grows in one place, on the peak overlooking this valley, a place the old ones called Widow's Leap." Widow's Leap. The name sent a shiver down my spine. It was a notoriously treacherous climb, a sheer cliff face that was battered by unpredictable winds. "No one has climbed it in years," I said. "Not since." Not since the last man who tried fell to his death, Clara finished. But it is our only chance. Croft is moving too fast. That delivery tonight. He's escalating his plan. We don't have much time. The voices from the outer cavern faded as Croft's men presumably left, but the danger felt closer than ever. We had a chance, a real chance, to save everyone. But it was hanging by a thread that led to the top of an impossible cliff. "I'll go," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had a chance to think about them. "I'll climb it." Clara studied my face, her dark eyes searching for something. "This is not a task for the faint of heart, child. The mountain does not suffer fools." "I am not a fool," I said, my voice steady. "I am a woman with nothing left to lose." She nodded slowly. "Then you may be the only one who can do it." We agreed to wait until the next night, to give me time to rest and for her to prepare a pouch of herbs to help with the climb. I spent the day hidden in her secret chamber, listening to the mountain breathe around me. When I returned to Elias's house under the cover of a pre-dawn sky, he was frantic. He grabbed me, his hands on my shoulders, checking me for injuries. The relief on his face when he saw I was unharmed was so profound it made my heart ache. I told him everything. About the stockpile of poison, about Clara being alive, about the antidote, and about Widow's Leap. The color drained from his face. "No," he said, the word a flat command. "It's too dangerous. I forbid it." The old Margaret would have shrunk back. She would have obeyed. But I wasn't her anymore. "You don't get to forbid me from doing anything, Elias," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "This is my choice. This is my fight, too." Just then, a shadow fell across the doorway. We both turned. Silas Croft stood there, flanked by two of his largest men. He was smiling, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Hart," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was just in the neighborhood. I heard you had a visitor." His eyes flickered to me, a glint of cruel amusement in their depths. "And I came to offer my condolences. Tragedy has a way of finding you, doesn't it? It's a shame about your first wife. Such a clumsy woman, always wandering too close to the edge of cliffs." The threat was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. Croft didn't just suspect Elias. He was toying with him, dangling the truth of his wife's death like a bauble. Elias went rigid, his hands clenching into fists. I could feel the rage radiating off him, a dangerous, barely contained inferno. For a terrifying second I thought he was going to launch himself at Croft. But he held his ground, his jaw tight. "Get out of my house, Croft," he snarled. Croft chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Such hostility, Doctor. I'm merely a concerned citizen. We wouldn't want your new companion to have an accident as well. The mountains can be so treacherous this time of year." He tipped his hat to me, his eyes lingering for a moment too long, and then he and his men were gone. The silence they left behind was heavy with unspoken violence. "His wife," I whispered. "She didn't just get sick." "No," Elias said, his voice choked with a grief so old and deep it was part of his bones. "Her name was Eleanor. She was a botanist. She loved these mountains. She was the first to notice the plants near the river were dying. She started testing the water long before anyone got sick. She figured it out, Margaret. She was going to expose him." He sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "He pushed her from Widow's Leap. He made it look like a fall. The sheriff, bought and paid for by Croft, ruled it an accident. No one believed me. Now I understood the depth of his despair, the reason he tried to push me away. He wasn't just grieving. He was drowning in guilt. "The letters," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "You weren't sending for a bride." He looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I was sending for an ally, a stranger, Someone from outside who Croft wouldn't know, wouldn't suspect. I used the mail-order bride story as a cover. I needed someone to get into that mine, to find the proof I never could. The letters were a test. I filled them with details of a quiet life to attract someone gentle, but I hoped they would be read by someone strong. Someone who wouldn't turn away from broken things, I finished, remembering his words from my first day here. "I'm so sorry, Elias," I whispered. "I never should have let you get involved." "Don't you dare say that," I said, kneeling in front of him, my hands covering his. "He didn't break you, and he won't break us." The fire was lit. There were no more doubts, no more fears. There was only the mission. That night I made my way to the base of Widow's Leap. The cliff face was a sheer wall of granite and ice, disappearing into the swirling clouds above. It looked impossible. Clara met me there, her face grim in the moonlight. She handed me a small leather pouch. "Herbs for strength," she said, "and for courage." I took the pouch and began to climb. It was a brutal, unforgiving ascent. The wind tore at me, trying to rip me from the rock. My fingers, raw and bleeding, searched for tiny holds in the icy stone. My lungs burned with the effort. Several times I slipped, my boots skittering on loose rock. Each time I managed to find a new hold, my body screaming in protest. The memory of Croft's threat, of Elias's pain, fueled me. I climbed for them. I climbed for Eleanor. I climbed for the town of Mercy Ridge. Hours passed. My world shrank to the few feet of rock in front of me. Hand over hand, foot over foot. Don't look down. Don't think. Just climb. Finally, my hand closed over the top ledge. With a final agonizing pull, I hauled myself onto the summit. I lay there, gasping, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The peak was a small, wind-swept plateau, and there, in the center, sheltered by a ring of ancient, twisted stones, was a patch of delicate white flowers. They glowed with a faint, ethereal light in the darkness. The ghost lily. I had made it. I carefully harvested the blossoms, placing them in the pouch Clara had given me. The journey down was just as perilous, but the hope I carried made my feet feel lighter. But as I reached the bottom, my heart sank. A lone figure was waiting for me. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't Elias. It was one of Croft's men, a cruel-faced brute I'd seen in town, and he was holding a rifle. "The boss knew you'd be foolish enough to try," he sneered. "He wants the flowers, and he wants you." My mind raced. The pistol. It was still in my coat, but he was too far away, his rifle already aimed at my chest. I was trapped. I clutched the pouch of lilies to my chest. I had not come this far, endured this much, to fail now. "You'll have to kill me to get them," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That can be arranged." He took a step forward, raising the rifle. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the rocks behind him. It moved with a silent, deadly grace. It was Elias. He held a heavy tree branch, and he brought it down with all his force on the back of the man's head. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. I stared at Elias, shocked. "I had a feeling you'd be too stubborn to stay put," I said, a shaky laugh escaping my lips. "I told you," he said, his chest heaving. "I'm not letting him take anyone else from me." He pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. It wasn't a passionate embrace, but something far more profound. It was the desperate, clinging hold of two survivors who had found a reason to keep fighting in each other. "We have to get this to Clara," I said, pulling away. "We don't have much time." We raced back to the mine, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. But when we reached the hidden entrance, we found it torn open. The canvas was ripped to shreds. We rushed into Clara's secret chamber. It was destroyed, Her herbs were scattered, her vials smashed, her notes torn to pieces. The antidote was gone. Pinned to the table with a hunting knife was a single, mocking note. I know everything. You're next. Croft had found her. He had taken her. And he had destroyed our only hope. Or so he thought. I looked at the wreckage, a cold fury building inside me. He didn't destroy it, I said, my voice low. He just made it harder to find. Elias looked at me, confused. I reached into the pouch and pulled out the ghost lilies. Then I pulled out a small folded piece of paper I had tucked in with them. It was Clara's formula for the antidote. She had given me a copy just in case. She was smarter than him, I whispered. We stared at each other, the crumpled paper a fragile beacon in the darkness. We had the formula. We had the final ingredient. But Croft had Clara, and he knew we were coming. We raced back to Elias's house, the feeling of a closing trap tightening around us. We were out of time. The war was no longer silent. It was about to become very, very loud. We barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them. The small physician's house became a fortress. Elias worked quickly, his medical knowledge finding a new, grim purpose. He showed me how to mix powders that would create a thick, choking smoke when ignited. He laid out every sharp instrument he owned on the kitchen table. We were no longer a doctor and a mail-order bride. We were soldiers preparing for a siege. The sun began to set, painting the snow outside in shades of blood and violet. The silence of the town returned, but now it was different. It was the tense, waiting silence before a storm breaks. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. We sat by the fire, the pistol on the table between us, and waited. The first sound was the crunch of boots on snow, then another, and another. Soon it was a chorus of them, the sound of a small army surrounding our tiny sanctuary. Muffled voices, the metallic click of rifles being cocked. "They're here," Elias said, his voice grim. I picked up the pistol, the weight of it feeling familiar now, comfortable. My hand was perfectly steady. The first blow struck the front door, a heavy thud that shook the entire house. Then another, and another. They were using a battering ram. The wood splintered. The barricade groaned in protest. "Light the powders," Elias ordered. I ran to the windows, lighting the small piles of chemicals he had prepared. A thick, acrid smoke instantly filled the porch, causing the men outside to cough and curse. It bought us a few precious seconds. The window in the parlor shattered, and the barrel of a rifle poked through. Elias was there in an instant, a heavy iron skillet in his hand, bringing it down on the rifle with a deafening clang. The rifle clattered to the floor inside. He grabbed it. We now had 2 guns. But there were at least a dozen of them outside. The front door was beginning to give way. A large crack appeared down the center. Any second now, they would be through. I looked at Elias, his face illuminated by the firelight, streaked with soot and sweat. He looked terrified, but he also looked alive, more alive than I had ever seen him. He was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was a man fighting for a future that included me. He caught my eye and gave me a small, grim smile. "Whatever happens, Margaret," he said, "I'm glad you came." "Me too," I whispered. The door exploded inwards, splinters of wood flying across the room. The first of Croft's men charged in, his face a mask of rage. I raised the pistol, closed my eyes, and fired. The recoil slammed my arm back, a scream. When I opened my eyes, the man was on the floor, and more were pouring in behind him. Just as I thought we were about to be overwhelmed, a new sound cut through the chaos, a gunshot from outside. But it wasn't aimed at the house. It was aimed at Croft's men. Then another, and a third. A chorus of shouts erupted from the yard. "Leave 'em be! Get away from that house, you devils!" Through the broken doorway, I could see them, the townspeople, the few who were still healthy enough to stand. They had come out of their shuttered homes armed with hunting rifles, axes, and pitchforks. They were a pathetic-looking army, gaunt and weary, but their eyes burned with a righteous fury. At the head of them was the sheriff, a man who had spent months looking the other way, his face now set with a grim determination. He had finally found his courage. The tide was turning. Croft's men, caught between us inside and the angry mob outside, hesitated. They were paid thugs, not soldiers willing to die for a cause. Silas Croft, who had been directing the attack from horseback, saw his plan unraveling before his eyes. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. With a roar of fury, he pulled a torch from a sconce on his horse, galloped to the side of the house, and hurled it onto the roof. The dry timber caught instantly. Flames licked up the side of the wall, smoke pouring into the room. He was going to burn us alive. "The cellar!" Elias yelled, grabbing my arm. "There's a tunnel." He dragged me towards the back of the house, towards a trapdoor I hadn't noticed before. It led down into a root cellar. My wife, Eleanor, she showed it to me. It comes out by the creek. We scrambled down the ladder just as the roof above the parlor began to collapse in a shower of sparks and flame. The tunnel was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. We crawled on our hands and knees, the sounds of the battle and the roaring fire fading behind us. We finally emerged into the cold night air, coughing and gasping behind the main line of the fight. The house was now a raging inferno, lighting up the night sky. Croft was watching it burn, a triumphant, insane grin on his face. He thought he had won. He didn't see us coming. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. The townspeople, enraged by the burning of the doctor's house, surged forward. Croft was pulled from his horse, his power vanishing as soon as his boots touched the ground. Justice, when it finally came, was delivered not by a court or a lawman, but by the hands of the people he had tried to destroy. They found Clara locked in the back of a wagon, shaken but unharmed. The rest of Croft's men surrendered. The war was over. I stood with Elias, watching the last embers of his home die out. Everything he owned, every memory, was gone, turned to ash. He had nothing left. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the flickering glow. "I have nothing to offer you now, Margaret," he said, his voice hollow. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing with his. I looked at the townspeople, their faces filled with hope for the first time in months. I looked at Clara, already directing the construction of a makeshift infirmary. I looked at the future. "We have everything," I said. Spring came to Mercy Ridge that year, not as a gentle thaw, but as a fierce, determined rebirth. With Croft gone and the antidote being administered by Clara and Elias, the town slowly came back to life. The first sound was the ring of hammers on new wood as people began to repair their homes. Then came the laughter of children, a sound that had been absent for so long it felt like a miracle. We rebuilt Elias's house on the same spot, but it wasn't his house anymore. It was ours. The townspeople helped, every one of them contributing a piece of lumber, a day's labor, a meal for the workers. It was a house built not just of wood and nails, but of gratitude and community. The empty cradle found its way back to the parlor, but it didn't stay empty for long. A wagon train, hearing that the quarantine was lifted, passed through on their way to Oregon. They left behind 3 small children whose parents had not survived the winter journey. A little girl with eyes as old as the mountains, and her 2 younger brothers. They had no one. That night they slept by our fire. The next morning they were still there, and the morning after that. One day the little girl, whose name was Sarah, started calling me Ma, and I let her. I didn't just mend the town's clothes, I helped mend its heart. Elias, free from the weight of his vengeance, became the man he was always meant to be, a healer not just of bodies but of souls. He smiled more. He laughed. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a warm, steady light. He taught the boys how to fish. I taught Sarah how to read. We became a family, pieced together from broken parts, stronger than we had ever been alone. We never spoke of marriage, not in the traditional sense. There was no proposal, no ring. Our vows had been made in smoke and fire, in shared fear and silent understanding. But one Sunday afternoon, as we stood on the porch of our new home, watching the children play in the meadow, he turned to me. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said softly. It was the highest compliment he could give. He took my hand. "Let's go talk to the preacher." We were married the following week in the newly built chapel. The whole town was there. I didn't wear a dress of linen and lace. I wore a simple cotton dress, the same one I'd worn to climb a mountain and fight a war. As the preacher spoke the words, I looked at Elias, at our children, at the faces of the people we had fought for. I had come to Mercy Ridge looking for a place to hide, a place to be safe. But I had found something infinitely better. I had found a place to be needed. I had found a home. Sometimes the life you run from is the one that leads you exactly where you need to be. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't found in whispered promises, but in the silent, steady choice to stay and fight for the light when all you've ever known is darkness. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We share tales of courage and resilience from the Wild West that remind us that even in the most broken places, hope can take root and build something beautiful. What part of Margaret's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and share this story with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to start a new chapter.